This is because, our research studies, a key tenet is that participation must be voluntary, and individuals who are incarcerated have experienced a long history of abuse in the context of research because of the involuntary nature in many cases, and especially early on in research participation. So just briefly, our prison research, I would say, infrastructure really boomed after World War II. Before World War II, there were examples of prison-based studies, but it was really a cottage industry of studies here and there. But examples included using individuals who are incarcerated to understand natural history of diseases such as cholera, etiology of pellagra, in some cases very odd, almost quack type experiments, such as those conducted in San Quentin prison in California, which incidentally now has some of the strongest protections of human subjects who are incarcerated. But where individuals, in the early 1920 era were being transplanted, basically individuals who were impacted with mental illness were receiving testicular transplants from those who had been executed in order to understand efficacy in sexual function. And then including in the early era, we had vaccine work, which I mentioned just because we're all very much thinking about COVID-19 vaccine work and the degree to which it is ethical to include individuals who are incarcerated in those trials. It was really during the World War II era that we started to see a boom in use of individuals who are incarcerated. There was this feeling that everyone should be chipping in to the war effort, and including those who are incarcerated. So there was a proliferation of biomedical research to understand natural history, to understand treatments in order to, save US soldiers' lives, but also to understand natural history for bioterrorist effects. And, US studies became studied themselves in the context of Nuremberg Trials, which were being held, of course, to prosecute Nazi war criminals, including physicians who had been conducting research among detained individuals. And it was US physicians that went over to provide testimony in the trials. And in cross-examination, Nazi lawyers pointed out our own research infrastructure in our prisons, which then led to investigations and a JAMA report that came out that deemed those studies conducted in the US ideal because indeed it was considered that voluntary consent was given. So this did not put a kibosh on prison-based research in the US. In fact, it led to a proliferation of research that was in sort of tandem with this increase in NIH funding after the war effort, an increase in regulations, FDA regulations that mandated drug testing. And so we then had huge numbers of people who are incarcerated that were partaking in non-therapeutic studies because it was guaranteed that they were going to show up. And it was only in the late 60s and early 70s where we saw political and social changes, but also atrocities in the context of other vulnerable populations and research being conducted, such as the Tuskegee study, which brought to light the challenges and the power of the research infrastructure in in violations of human rights across multiple vulnerable populations. This led to legislation in the 70s, reduction in our studies in jails and in prisons during the 70s, and ultimately the Beaumont Report, which articulates our three key principles that must guide our ethical conduct of research, which I'll talk about in the context of my own studies. And these were sort of codified in the 1990s when our federal policy for protection of human subjects was written, and this is what we call common rule, and common rule has protections for vulnerable populations, and Part C protects those who are currently incarcerated. So I'll talk about these in the context of research. So just to review for those who are less familiar, the three tenets that are upheld in the Belmont report are when conducting research, we must consider the respect of the individual, justice, and beneficence. So respect is when individuals are treated as autonomous agents, and individuals with diminished autonomy, such as individuals who are incarcerated, must receive additional protections given the diminished autonomy. Justice requires that there's equitable distribution of research benefits and burdens. And beneficence is when we aim for the research benefits to outweigh the risks. So in prison-based and jail-based research, there really is a tension between respect and autonomy and protection and avoiding coercion with justice and ensuring individuals who are incarcerated also have research that potentially could lead to innovations and interventions for that population. So there's been a movement away from this dip in research in the late 70s to now we have over 180 studies in our jails and prisons with the purpose of trying to improve health among those who are incarcerated. Okay, so how do we respect each of these tenets? So respect and autonomy. So the first thing is to ensure or to optimize the likelihood that consent indeed is voluntary and there is minimal coercion in the consent process. We want to say no coercion, but it's still a detained environment, and that's always possible. So that's why I sort of use that language. But we are trying to ensure no coercion and ensure that consent is indeed truly voluntary and informed. So how do we do this? I mean, I can get into more details later, but we have to be very mindful through the entire process. For example, screening and recruitment. How do we even obtain the names of individuals who would meet eligibility criteria for our study? Different states have different requirements. In some states, I live in the North now, there are more strict requirements where you have individuals approached by someone within the facility, sign a release of information consent form, and then at that point, their name can be given to me to contact them to see if they may be interested. But again, different states have different rules. We reduce correctional staff involvement during the recruitment and the study activities. And the degree to which this can happen depends on the facility. But really research should be conducted by the research team, or within a correctional setting, there are so many players, individuals involved in health and addiction services, individuals in programs, and involving those individuals, if someone from the inside needs to be involved, is optimal to involving correctional staff whose job is really to secure the facility. The informed consent process must indicate very clearly that participation has no impact on a participant's sentence or release or healthcare to, again, avoid coercion. In order to do this, we really ensure that the study instrumentation can be comprehended at a range of reading levels. And we have a question-answer period at the end of the consent to ensure that people indeed know what the study is about and what we would be asking of them. And also to know that they can elect to participate in the study, but then opt out of certain procedures they feel less comfortable with. Incentives is a tricky thing. Usually we do not provide incentives during the period of incarceration, again, to avoid coercion. But in the most recent conversations with correctional staff, we've started to try to think about how can we respect individuals' time by offering something such as reimbursement to a commissary fund, et cetera. But by and large, incentives are not given during the period of incarceration. They may be given after release in a post-release study, for example. We try to optimize the benefit and reduce the risk. So this goes to even what questions are we asking? What interventions are we testing? So we try to optimize the benefit by having individuals who are involved in, who have been impacted by incarceration, involved with community advisory boards that sort of guide our study process. We do this by trying to conduct qualitative research early to ensure that we're asking the right questions. And even if we are doing a study on a particular topic, it still isn't too late to integrate additional study questions that come up from the population that's being studied that could be integrated, and that really improves the science of the study. And then again, we do a lot of cognitive interviewing to ensure that the questions we ask are appropriate, that they're not going to stigmatize. And if so, we take those out, or we think about other ways that we can ask the same thing that potentially is less stigmatizing, and to ensure that the process is one that people feel good about, as good as possible. And that means there could be heterogeneity, because individuals who are incarcerated come from a range of backgrounds, just as in any study situation. For some, face-to-face may feel more appropriate. Others may feel okay with a more technologically based interview, for example. And then finally, of course, if it's an intervention study, ensuring that all participants have access to the intervention after the study. And even in an observational setting, making sure that we use the data that we collect, that we use the time that we've taken among participants to ensure that we disseminate the findings adequately to both scientific and non-scientific, more policy relevant venues. And then quickly, reducing the negative impact. When I first got into this, I assumed, okay, well, people who are incarcerated, they're just going to be there, they have time. But actually, there is a negative impact on work release opportunities, on meal times, and there is a real fatigue and potential stigmatization that has to be considered, and our research processes aim to reduce these negative impacts. Finally, I'm just going to briefly mention confidentiality. It's important for all of our research, but it really is tricky in a jail or prison environment to make sure that confidentiality is obtained, maintained. So to the best degree possible, if we can, when people are called for participation, that others around them don't know why they are called, that there's a sort of vague reason given for why they may be called down for participation in a program. To ensure that a guard is not in the room to the best degree possible. They could be outside the door, but in order for there to be confidentiality, to ensure that the study team only is really there during the interview. And then things like informed consent forms that we typically give to all participants. We assume that we won't give them. We have copies if individuals wish to take them, but it's assumed that if it's a post-release study and we see them in the community, that at that point we can give them a copy of their consent. And then all NIH studies now protect individuals' information with a certificate of confidentiality. But if you have a CDC study or another an NIJ study, ensuring that you apply for one of those to ensure that participant information is protected is critical. And then justice. So, equitable access to research for those who wish to participate. So, in recent studies that I've been involved in, there have been cases where potentially there's an unintentional reduction of autonomy of individuals because sometimes researchers may become overprotective. And a topic that is potentially something an individual may wish to get involved in, it's assumed that it would be too sensitive to engage that an incarcerated in that type of research. And to that, I think we should just rely on being data-driven and go back to our cognitive interviewing to ensure, to the best degree possible, individuals who wish to participate indeed have that ability. And so just in summary, this is the last slide. Through these sort of methods, we are trying to uphold principles by community engagement, qualitative and open-ended questions early, a real eye with ensuring in our processes and in our study documentation, we avoid coercion and protect confidentiality, and to make sure that there is indeed benefit to participate, and then to avoid unintentional reduction of autonomy or paternalism in the context of our research. And that's the end of mine.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. And now I'm going to invite Dr. Ryder to give us sort of an overview of her thinking and how she's been understanding the challenges and opportunities of doing this kind of research with incarcerated individuals.
Absolutely. And first, Dana, thanks so much for bringing us all together. And Dr. Khan, I have to say, I've been one of those people in the background criticizing a lot of research that happens in prisons for years. And it's so refreshing to hear your perspective. I think that was very clear and exactly what I would want to see from people doing this kind of research, and too often don't. So it's, I think it's really important and exciting to have this, especially now at a time when clearly there is a desperate need to address the health problems people are facing in prison, and we have to think about how to do it ethically. And frankly, we haven't done a good job of that over time. And so it's really great to have these frameworks. So I thought I'd talk a little, most of my work is, I come from an interdisciplinary background. I have a law degree, and that's kind of the approach with which I come to the ethics questions around prison research, which I've written about. But I also have a degree in jurisprudence and social policy, which is a form of criminology, right? So I bring all kinds of methods to my work to understand people's experiences in prison. I use interviewing, I analyze quantitative administrative data, I talk to prisoners and staff, I do extended ethnographic observations, and I've done a fair amount of work looking at kind of historically and legally how policies change over time. So, I'm not, I am not an epidemiologist or a doctor, but I have increasingly come to see public health as a really vital framework with which to see our prisons. So it's exciting to be in this dialogue. But I thought I'd just talk a little about the work I have done and the ethical challenges I've seen that I think are, even though I haven't necessarily been doing sort of epidemiologically focused work, I think these ethical challenges come up in any kind of research in prison. So just as an overview, I've done hundreds of surveys and systematic qualitative interviews with both correctional officials and prisoners in facilities in Los Angeles, throughout the state of California, in Washington state, and also internationally. I've done a fair amount of work in Denmark looking at Scandinavian prison policies. Much of my work generally just focuses on the lived experience of incarceration, and especially its more extreme iterations. So I'm an expert on long-term solitary confinement, how it's come about, how it's been used, and what its effects are. And there I've done sort of veered more into the health field, looking particularly at trying to document the psychological effects and also sometimes the physical effects of long-term solitary confinement through interviews and administrative record reviews. I've also collected and analyzed quantitative corrections data on demographics, behavior, and prisoner well-being in California and Washington. And then I have this sort of side interest where I write about the conflict between excessive limitations on sociological research in prison. So, as someone who conducts qualitative interviews about prisoners' experiences, I often face really significant barriers to convincing people I can do that ethically. And on the flip side, I've written about how on the biological research side, often the protections are inadequate. And so there's this challenge, right, of no matter how we're going into prison to conduct research, we have to think about doing it ethically. And I think, ironically, the result of the history that Dr. Khan talked about is that people kind of assume that there's all these protections prohibiting biological research. But it turns out biological research in terms of drug trials or more invasive procedures in prison has continued in spite of all these protections. So you see these investigative reports from time to time where prisoners have participated in things that look like phase 3 drug trials, even if they're not called that, or sometimes prisoners are sentenced by a judge into some kind of alternative treatment program that's actually a drug trial, or prisoners are participating in some kind of medical program that's focused on health problems that face prisoners particularly, but there's disturbing questions of coercion. And just from a legal perspective, the ways in which this happens most often is when you have a lot of privatization. So, the human subjects regulations that Dr. Khan overviewed so helpfully really apply to people receiving public funding in public facilities. And so if you have a totally privatized prison facility or you have a drug company running a drug trial, it's much harder to have oversight and regulation of that. And that's where I see the most abuses occurring in kind of biomedical research in prisons. But I think one important thing is to say, on the biomedical side, the abuses haven't been completely eliminated. And so that's why it's so important and heartening to see Dr. Khan's research and the ethical approach to it. And then on the sociological side, I think there are incredible barriers to getting into prison that often kind of increase the opacity of these facilities, right? So if prison officials and institutional review boards are resistant to someone going in to conduct a qualitative interview about lived experience, that means it's hard to do the kind of qualitative groundwork that Dr. Khan is advocating you need to do in order to understand if you're asking questions that aren't stigmatizing and troubling, or kind of missing the base of what prisoners are experiencing. So I think we need both, and we just have to think really carefully about how to do it ethically. And so I wanted to talk just about some of the ethical challenges I've seen and have tried to highlight in some of my writing. So I'll talk about basically three that I'd kind of like to highlight. The first is that the constraints on prisoners' well-being in our criminal justice system are pervasive, extreme, and frequently life-threatening. And so when we talk about coercion, we have to understand that we're talking about people who may not be able to meet their basic needs on an everyday basis in our prisons. And so, I could give multiple examples, but one of the best is from major class action litigation out of California that reached the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court noted that one prisoner a day in the state of California, once seen as a progressive prison system, one prisoner a week was dying unnecessarily because of inadequate medical care. So there were stories of things like prisoners dying of abscessed teeth. So when you think about a situation where the medical care is so inadequate that the only remedy the courts can find is to order that hundreds, if not thousands of people be released, and that they can document that one prisoner a week is dying unnecessarily, it's really hard to imagine how you cannot, right? How anything that's providing any kind of care is not potentially inherently coercive, right? In that context. And so that's one thing I often really highlight in thinking about this, is just understanding the sheer horror of the conditions in so many of our prisons. And this is all the more true right now, where a pandemic is raging through prisons, where people can't social distance, don't have access to protective equipment. And I think it's just a really important foundation for understanding, because if you don't read news every day about our prisons and you don't go in and out of facilities across this country, it can be hard to recognize just how restrictive and harsh the conditions are. And I think that has to be a kind of baseline of understanding when we think about how do we ethically gain consent and think about doing research. And I think related to that point is that no matter how careful you are, you're going to encounter ethical challenges in your research in prison, right? There is no way to design a perfect study that isn't going to end up with a situation where you think, if you're ethical, right? And if you're really thinking about these things, where you think, oh my gosh, what in the world have I done, and how can I go forward, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why this conversation is so important to have, is to create resources and conversations where people can say, oh, I can't do this perfectly. I have to understand that there are going to be challenges, and I need resources of people to go to when I have those challenges, right? And I think it's one of the ways in which, as an oversight infrastructure, our review boards and our human subjects protections have maybe failed, and that they've encouraged people to kind of pretend those ethical conundrums don't come up instead of actually engaging them. So, just to give a couple examples, I think things that come up really often, especially if you're doing interviews with prisoners, the physical conditions in which you're interviewing them, especially if you want to interview them in a private setting, right? So I interview people in long-term solitary confinement. These are the people considered by the prison system to be the absolutely most dangerous in the system. So it's often a real battle about, I want to be in a room alone with them, right? And what is that physically going to look like for those people? And in some cases, that means they put me in an attorney visiting booth and we're separated by plexiglass, right? And then the prisoner is free and able to move about in the booth that they're in, but we're talking to each other through a phone, and it's, it can be kind of distant. In some cases, that means I sit in a room, like a hearing room, and the prisoner is cuffed with their hands and their feet, and often their hands cuffed to their waist. And there's not an officer in that room, but that prisoner is in a really uncomfortable situation. Neither of those is ideal, right? And some of what my work has been really talking with prisoners about what would you prefer, and different prisoners prefer different things, and trying to work with the prisoners and the staff to figure out what's going to make everyone in the situation maximally comfortable and safe. And I think, my ethical calculation is not talking to those prisoners at all is also really troubling, because they're in the most hidden places in the country. And so we all have to work together to figure out how to do it in a way everybody can agree is safe. But, there are people who say we can't talk to them at all because of those conditions, right? So I think kind of understanding issues like that come up, and really trying to incorporate everybody who's involved in the research, and that includes prison staff, right? Who, if they feel unsafe, may well retaliate against their prisoners later, or retaliate against you, or shape the research. So really trying to figure out how to have that participatory conversation about how everybody can feel safe in the situation, and still have these incredibly important conversations where we do understand what's going on. I think the other thing that comes up really often is just the idea of quid pro quo, right? That a prisoner, we think, as Dr. Khan said, I agree completely. It's really hard in a prison setting to give incentives, because what they have is so distorted, right? If you're talking about someone who can't see a doctor about an abscessed tooth and might die, if you give them $5 to make a phone call, that may be incredibly influential in terms of their decision, right? It's hard to think about what incentive you could give that wouldn't be fantastically influential in situations that are this restrictive. And I think often prisoners are just so happy to talk to someone who will listen, that is its own incentive. But for better or worse, right? Even that incentive raises questions. If someone is endangering themselves by talking to you, if they feel like that human contact is so important, if they feel like maybe they'll, no matter what you say about what the impacts will be, if they feel like by talking to you, they might look better in the eyes of staff and might get some favor, right? And people talk about those things. And so it's where this idea of really doing the cognitive work to understand, can people ask questions? Do they understand what the implications of the research are is so vital. But again, it's just to say, no matter how careful you are, these issues are going to come up. And I think having a community where you can talk about them and address them is so important. So that's kind of one. And I think in terms of that, this idea that ethical challenges are going to arise in part because the institutions are so restrictive. I think Dr. Khan provided one really important counterpoint, which is incorporating prisoners in every stage of the research design, right, is one really important way. And there are fantastic communities of formerly incarcerated prisoners who are available and do this work. And there are also people, I write to people inside, especially people who have reached out to me. They're often a great resource for talking about this. And I think, continuing to develop those communities of folks, not just who are formerly incarcerated, but who are inside and can help think about this is really important. And I think another counterpoint is just transparency, right? It doesn't help to say I didn't encounter any ethical problems in my research. When I see that, I think, well, were you thinking about it at all, right? So really, creating the mechanisms to figure out how to engage with these issues. So that's the first point. The second point that I don't see made often enough, and I kind of hinted at, is that correctional staff are vital to this research. The longer I've done this, the more I've started to incorporate them, not just as colleagues who help me think about how to do this, because as I said, if they don't feel safe, there are real liabilities for the prisoners they're dealing with and for the research staff I'm sending into a prison. But also because they're suffering in these institutions also, right? And I think we often forget that when we talk about these highly restrictive environments where, for instance, right now, an incredibly dangerous infectious disease is running rampant, prison staff are also scared, in danger, and need attention in this context. And they're just, the effects are different, but they are suffering from the same kinds of restrictions and public health risks that prisoners are. And I think, increasingly I've come to incorporate them in my research to say, if I'm interviewing prisoners, I want to talk to staff also about what the health impacts are of these conditions that you're coming into and working on, both because I don't think it makes sense to separate their experiences, and because I think they're much more likely to be helpful in talking to prisoners and sensitive to that population if I'm also talking to them and they don't feel like they're being excluded while they're scared and endangered. So that, that's my personal take, is actually incorporating them in the as research participants can be really important. But absent that, if you are doing something really focused on prisoners, I think incorporating them as, even if they're often resisting the work, as potential collaborators who have a lot of insights and whose fears about the work you're doing really can stop what you're doing, and trying to engage with them over that, I think is really important. And it took me a long time to get to a place where I could sit down with an officer in a long-term solitary confinement unit and not just come to that conversation with a whole set of assumptions about what their ethical values were that made the conversation really hard to have. And I think, in the same way, I try to sit down with a prisoner and not bring a set of assumptions about their experiences and values to the conversation. I think that can be really helpful with correctional staff also. And the last kind of ethical thing I want to say, and then I'm excited to talk with all of you, is that I think trust is this really important and complex issue in prison, and it's worth really thinking about what we can and can't trust. And I think it's counterintuitive in two ways. One, I think there's often an assumption, and especially in criminology, I read this really often, like you can't possibly trust these prisoner subjects you interviewed to be honest reporters, right? They're criminals. And so I think one thing is to understand that in my experience and in an increasing body of literature, prisoners as reporters in these contexts about their experiences and even about their criminal histories, their gang affiliations, their health experiences, tend to be incredibly reliable reporters. And I think that's a really important foundational thing to understand. There's this sense that, oh, maybe someone who has a long criminal record isn't reliable. It turns out increasingly there's data that they're incredibly reliable, especially when they're describing the experiences they've had and they understand they're participating in a study trying to make sense of that. And so, for instance, I'm working on an article about having interviewed more than 100 prisoners in Washington state, and they were incredibly reliable reporters about whether they were gang associates or not. And that's one that's particularly, right, this isn't even about like, did you receive adequate health care or not? This is about something that could be potentially dangerous for them to report, but what they say matches up with administrative records. And so I think this kind of, this growing body of data suggesting that even on things that are pretty touchy, prisoners are actually pretty honest is really important to understand in doing this work, that they are in this context, the vast majority of the time, as trustworthy as other reporters in other research contexts, right? The flip side, though, is that I think there's often an assumption that administrative data is really trustworthy, right? While we question whether someone with a criminal record can honestly report and has incentives to maybe dishonestly report, we tend to assume that the administrative data we're looking at is accurate and honest. And I don't want to say that it's dishonest, but I don't think it's always trustworthy. And one really key reason to understand that is administrative data collected by prison officials isn't collected for any of our purposes, right? I suspect that almost everyone on this call is here because they're interested in doing research to understand what prisoners' experiences are, what the impacts of incarceration are, what the health effects are. That's not why correctional officials are collecting data, right? They're collecting data to maintain safety and security in their institutions. All they're doing the vast majority of the time is assessing risk and trying to mitigate risk for themselves and the prisoners they're charged with taking care of, right? Not for our broader communities even. So we have to understand how often correctional data is collected for that purpose, analyzed for that purpose, and look really carefully at what we're given when we're given administrative data and make sure we're understanding how the data was put together and collected, right? And make sure, again, this is why it's so important to have the relationships with correctional staff to be able to ask those questions, right? And I could give so many examples of this, but to go back to the gang question, I got a bunch of administrative data and I said, hey, there's this subcategory of gang data where none of my guys who I interviewed are reporting gang affiliation, but they're labeled in this file as having like, gang something with a gang flag. And I talked to correctional officials and they were like, oh, those are just people who were not sure, right? So they're people who are maybe under investigation. Or if you looked at that data and you didn't ask that question, you might think there were 30% more gang affiliated folks in the state prison system than what we knew, because they have a flag that looks exactly like the actual gang, confirmed gang member flag. And so it's just one of many examples of how we have to look really carefully at what's being coded and aggregated in administrative data, and as researchers kind of reanalyze it in collaboration with folks on the ground. So those are my kind of thoughts about what's important in doing this work, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you all about that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rader. So the next 20 minutes, we're going to be really engaging in a conversation. I encourage you three to also ask each other questions and really make this a dialogue. And I encourage the audience members, we have one substantive question, but I encourage audience members to also ask questions so that we could get to those in a timely fashion. I'm gonna start with some two preset questions, and then I'm going to open it up to audience discussion. The first is, so we talked a lot about the context and the history of abuse and exploitation of prisoners and incarcerated individuals, but we haven't yet talked about the historical context of racialized mass incarceration. And I was wondering if there's a way in which thinking about race and institutional racism has informed your methodology, has informed your considerations of justice, and in general has informed your views about the ethical challenges of doing this research. And maybe I'll start with Dr. Khan or Dr. Pera. I'll start with Dr. Pera.
No, don't start. This is maybe one of the harder questions to answer. And I clearly am the amateur in this group. I mean, I have done clinical trials for years back to AZT with prisoners and more recently in the COVID era. And questions like that about the racialized mass incarceration are clearly, you know, it's up front. Most of the prisoners we see, and let me just say, at University Hospital, we are in Columbus, we are the medical center. There's a facility, a correctional hospital, but anything that gets at all serious gets transferred to the medical center. And so we see most of the serious problems in the medical center that are not emergent and would go to a local institution. And as well, for years I have participated in telemedicine and actually in-person medicine of HIV care of prisoners in the correctional hospital, and then it evolved to telemedicine. So I'm familiar with this, but I mean, this question about racialized incarceration, it's an obvious thing, and how does it impact me? I don't really see, you know, in terms of medical care, there are issues that are more common in African Americans, and we always take those into consideration in terms of management or more complicated management. But I don't know that I can answer that. I mean, these two are experts, and they've probably thought about this specific issue, so I'll pass to them.
I can jump in. It is easier for me, I guess, to address this. I mean, I study effects of going through the criminal justice system, from policing to detainment and release, and the disruption on families, the impacts on children, you know, parental incarceration on children. And you can't think about the population level impact without thinking about race, because of the very disproportionate, you know, incarceration rate, in which we have 13% African Americans in the United States, 40% in our jail and prison system. And so it is front and center of why I do the research that I do, in trying to understand. And I also study HIV and STIs, which impact disproportionately minority groups, including African Americans. And so sort of the confluence of those two factors, this social determinant that impacts millions of African Americans going through our jail and prison systems, and these infectious disease outcomes, which disproportionately impact African Americans, is a reason why I choose to study this as a social determinant of health. As far as, and then it's like, what do you do? You know, like most recently with COVID, you know, it's one thing to try to make these links and provide a research base, but then with something like COVID, it's just so front and center, the blatant oppression of continuing to keep people in closed, confined areas in the middle of an infectious disease pandemic, and that it's disproportionately impacting Black and brown people. So then it becomes, you know, it has become even more so something to think about and write about and talk about outside of the research realm. You know, for the first time, finally I wrote a little op-ed because it was just so clear in this context how this racialized mass incarceration has to be addressed. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think the only thing I would add, I mean, both in terms of, you know, central motivation for doing this work is understanding the inequality and racism that's baked into our prisons, and seeing, one thing I often say about prisons is that you see all our social problems magnified in them. So lack of education, lack of a social safety net, lack of adequate healthcare. You see all that in prison so much more clearly. And I think that is perhaps the most true with race, right? Whereas you can go through society until recently, maybe, without understanding how often things happen to African Americans, like what happened to George Floyd recently. You can't walk into a prison without seeing that, right? Race is just built into the fabric of these places. There's, in general, prisoners tend to, through some combination of institutional and personal choice, tend to be very segregated. So you literally on a prison yard will see people congregating by different skin colors, and efforts to reform that in prisons have been very challenging. And I think, in terms of, to go back to some of the themes I highlighted, I think race is just integral to how people get characterized and treated in prison. And it's, when we talk about gangs, there's no separation between gangs and race, right? In prison, or very little. And so merely having a certain skin color can get you labeled as a member of a certain gang with very little evidence. In California, until a lawsuit a few years ago, what you were reading and who you were talking to could be considered evidence of gang membership. So reading something like the autobiography of Malcolm X or George Jackson's letters would get you labeled a member of the Black guerrilla family. So it just speaks to how things that we think of as maybe neutral categories, like risk assessments in terms of health or behavioral processes, are so bound up and so explicitly bound up with race in prison, and how this research is, how looking anew at that data and kind of starting over again as outside observers is so important to thinking about these issues and highlighting kind of the deep end of what goes wrong when we don't address these issues outside of prison.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask a combined question from the audience members. So one person asks, several research participants are also engaged with mental health services. What are your thoughts on ethically engaging individuals with mental health challenges and also intellectual disabilities in research? And another question was about legally authorized representatives, if that is an appropriate avenue for ensuring ethical authorization for participation in research. And
I'll talk a little bit.
Yeah, good.
No, I'll just talk about the latter. I mean, with COVID, we have had the opportunity to supply agents in an attempt to treat the pneumonias. And we have worked with the prison system such that the convalescent plasma or the remdesivir, which are still, quote, investigational agents, we've been able to make those available to prisoners who consent themselves without asking a warden if we can administer these investigational agents. But once they can't consent, these are agents that are really available to every other patient. And so what's fair for everybody else should be fair for the prisoners. And so, but they can't consent to get an investigational agent when they're intubated. We then will talk to the prison warden, who, again, if they understand that this is what we give everybody else, they'll do that. They'll permit that. But again, it was a little bit of work to get them to agree to start with that it was available to the prisoners like everybody else, if they could consent themselves. But illegally, for people who are intubated and can't give consent, we need a signed consent from a LAR.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if Dr. Wright or Dr. Khan have anything else to contribute.
In terms of legal representatives, I'll say, I have found that often, depending on where you are talking with the lawyers, if there are lawyers involved in kind of litigation oversight work post-conviction in a state, they can be really helpful. And In many states, that's increasingly P&A, protection and advocacy organizations, or disability rights organizations that have lawyers who are using their kind of mandate under the Americans with Disabilities Act and similar acts to conduct oversight and advocate on behalf of prisoners. And they can be a fantastic resource on both of these issues, right? First, it's nice to reach out to them if you're doing systematic research, because they can be kind of resistant and think you might not know what you're doing and you might be jeopardizing their clients. And so they can be good advocates to have. And they also can sometimes help address some of these issues, like what kinds of challenges people are facing and how you might interact with them ethically. So I guess that's one piece of advice I'd have. I think it's important not to write anyone off for the kind of transparency reasons I highlighted, to say, someone does, to say I can't talk to this person at all, or I can't engage with them, or I can't provide them a treatment that would be provided on the outside, is to strip them of agency on some level, right? So it's this really careful balance between, making sure you can engage with them ethically, but also not just writing people off who are in, the most vulnerable situations.
Yeah, I really appreciate hearing the responses of my colleagues. It's actually very helpful, and I have less to say on that. So I appreciate that question, whoever asked it. But about the mental health challenges, I can say something about that. I mean, basically, I think it is critical. I mean, there's such an overlap between, histories of mental and drug disorders among people who are coming through our jails and prisons, and to really understand how to best engage individuals who would be open to and seek treatment. It's unfortunate that in many settings, jails and prisons, access to care is better than in the community setting for this population. So while not wanting to make the point that we should always be trying to improve community-based care, but at the same time, engaging individuals who have needs, I think, is a critical health priority, public health priority. As far as like intervention approaches, I'm more on the behavioral side. And so this goes to like all types of research, but including intervention research, with this population, I think trying to be as person-centered and as empowering as possible in our intervention approaches is critical. So for example, there are some depression treatments. Depression is very common, pre and post release. Sometimes it's worse after release. And trying to outfit people with behavioral techniques such as behavioral activation that are very, that are skills-based, and encourage people to think about what they're going to do, especially when they get out, can be a very positive thing. And through that mechanism, that sort of behavioral activation, it addresses, it's very effective in reducing depression. So I think as we think about our therapies, there's more room, I think, within behavioral treatments, trying to be as person-centered and focus on treatments that have other benefits and that are strengths-based, I think is critical for this population, because they are, by definition, completely disempowered.
Thank you. So 1 hour is a very short amount of time, and we have a lot of really terrific questions. So one of the things we're going to do is make sure that the questions are available, and also some references, and potentially the slideshow will also be available. So I'm going to combine another 2 questions from the audience about proactive steps that we can take moving forward. So the first question is whether there is any training for staff or any sort of education that can ensure quality for care of prisoners, and especially Black prisoners. And then the second question, I'm just going to read this, and I'll have you think about it. So I'm a trauma and acute, this is Dr. Whitson. I'm a trauma and acute care surgeon at Ohio State, and we see the late stages of lack of care of surgical diseases, including trauma, in the patients who come to our facility from Franklin Medical Center. In the hospital, the patients are grouped in a separate section of the hospital, often 4 to a room. And there's a lack of all of which you mentioned: lack of respect, privacy, comprehensive treatment, especially now with many of them with COVID who are COVID positive. It is difficult to treat them as individuals, as we should as individuals, much less include them in research protocols because they are not in private rooms. Do you have any suggestions for how to develop a system while in the ED and while hospitalized to improve these conditions for individuals? So one is about training and the other is about systemic changes at the hospital. And maybe I'll let Dr. Pera start us off.
So no, it clearly, and as he described, that is the situation. And in each of those rooms, it's a four-bed room. There are individual rooms. With the COVID epidemic, actually, we would screen individuals who were positive and cluster them together and compare to the ones who were negative. It was actually complicated because we also had to check the guards as well, since they're the people who get out and catch it and bring it into the jail, or can. Mm-hmm. And so they are like that. And I mean, I've cared for those patients for years in individual rooms. You were careful. You pulled your drapes. You held your voice down. I mean, it was still a ward, and you had to take care of privacy in that regard. In terms of research studies, it's in Ohio, there actually is an IRB that exists at the prison, and so if anybody wants to do a research study on a prisoner, they need to go through the prison IRB, which has prison researchers, sociologists on that committee, as well as educators on that committee and staff on the committee and legal on the committee, and they decide what studies should be done. And so studies that really aren't of benefit to the prisoners or the administration as to what they can do to improve security or even care of the individuals doesn't get passed. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's in contrast to where many institutions, it's the usual IRB that has one prison administrator on it. This is their own IRB. And actually strictly medical procedures and drug trials are limited. They do not do placebo-controlled trials in general. I mean, there are exceptions to that, as with AZT in the first time we used it, where prisoners wanted to be on a placebo-controlled trial. But it is, and is there training? Actually, one of the studies that the IRB approved there is, one of the types of studies that the IRB approved, and most of them are sociologic studies actually, is asking prisoners and guards, what do you need to know about COVID? What do you need to know about protecting yourself? So there are surveys like that to see what the prisoners think should be done. And my understanding is that prisoners do like being surveyed because somebody's at least interested in their opinion. And they do voice it as very believably, as was pointed out by Dr. Reiter. I'll turn it over from there.
Thank you. Dr. Reiter, Dr. Khan, do you have any suggestions about sort of proactive measures, either training or institutionalizing in conditions in the hospital?
I'm not on the clinical side, so I'm more on the research side. And with our studies, it is critical to have training where there's a balance of professionalism. I mean, there's professionalism and a balance of friendliness with also setting boundaries in a way potentially that you may not feel you need to with a non-prison or jail population. So that's a reality. But first and foremost, it's about professionalism and respect. So I think the same would go in a clinical setting, just like we're talking about finally how we can be or need to be changing our police departments. You know, I think across the board, our research enterprises, our clinical enterprises, how can we be most mindful of interacting with respect. It's a basic thing. But it's a good question. I don't have a good answer, but I do think there needs to be institutionalized, like a response for how we can do this across these different settings, as opposed to piecemeal each person individually.
Thank you.
I have two much bigger picture kind of institutional thoughts. One is just, I think oversight is so important, right? And I mean, that's what we're starting to hear. I think our society is facing this moment of our police are on the streets and we see them every day, and yet obviously oversight has been inadequate. And in our prisons, people are locked behind doors where often no one can get inside, including right now, you know, families or lawyers often. And so oversight is all the more important there. And as we're at a social moment of thinking about how to institutionalize independent oversight, I think that's one really critical way to make sure people are being treated fairly. And the other thing I would say is just that I've seen again and again, especially in interviewing staff, and people have written about this a little, but the perpetual challenge that arises in caretaking in prison, which is a conflict between care and security, right? And so this is called the dual loyalty problem. And I think it's just, you know, I don't know that we have good, it's something that I've just seen people starting to write about really carefully and thoughtfully, but I think there aren't clear, easy answers about how to engage with someone who you feel like might be endangering you, or who a prison staff tells you as a caretaker is dangerous, and the thing that you would do to treat someone in a hospital context you're told is not acceptable or safe in a prison context. And I think really grappling with how to engage with that dual loyalty problem, where you've got this conflict between safety in a prison setting and healthcare, is really, really important. And I think, you know, to my biased perspective as someone who's been in the prisoners' rights and advocacy community for a long time, you know, too often if we've got a scale, the balance weighs against security, you know, weighs in favor of security and against care. And so really thinking about how to make that balance more even, if not, you know, actually weighing in favor of care is really important. So that's, I mean, I would say, you know, thinking about trainings, that would be a key thing to address and engage with.
Well, I would like to thank Dr. Ryder, Dr. Pera, and Dr. Khan for really starting this conversation for us at OSU. I think that this is just showing how tricky these questions are. And we will have a broadcast of this discussion on the Center for Ethics and Human Values. So please check that out. But thank you so much for contributing to this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.